And hello to everyone. We're still waiting for a few seconds for the Zoom to populate. In the meantime, if you're here and you want to just drop us a quick hello and say where you are connecting from, it would be wonderful to hear from you. We've got Palestine, Chicago, Philly. Wonderful. Nice to see everyone. Turkey, Algeria, Dubai. This is wonderful. Austin, Texas, Florida, another from Dubai. It's wonderful to see you all here. Wonderful to see you all here. Thank you. Thanks for joining, everyone. Cambridge, Massachusetts. Nice to see you, Nancy. Nice to see you. All right. And from Bombay, nice to have you. Thank you. Westminster, Maryland. All right. I think we will get started then. It looks like it stopped populating. So welcome to the Palestine Rights Festival. It's really a delight to be with you today. My name is Deanna Butu, and I'm really honored to be moderating today's panel on children's and young adult literature today. We've got a really amazing panel, which I will introduce very shortly. And before I do that, I very much want to thank all of the people who put this festival together. They put it together the first time so that we could all be together in person. And of course, the pandemic hit, but they remained undeterred. And here we are together 9 months later in December with even better, stronger, and of course on a virtual platform. Even though we are virtual, we are all connected. And I'm hoping that given that we're all connected, that you're going to take the time to ask some questions of our panelists. Before I begin, though, I do want to thank each and every one of the organizers, all these people who are so far, who've been nameless and faceless for many. I want to thank you all. This has really been an incredible festival so far, and I hope that today's event is going to continue along in that fantastic tradition. For those of you who are interested or who need it, there is simultaneous translation available. You just have to hit at the bottom of your screen where it says interpretation. You can hit interpretation, and one of our translators, both very excellent, will be doing the translating from English to Arabic, and for those who need it, from Arabic to English. For those of you who would like to ask a question, you'll see that there's a Q&A function to the left of the interpretation button. And of course, you can pose your question there. So thank you all. Thank you to all of the people who have attended. And I want to begin. By giving some short introductions to all of these wonderful people, wonderful authors on our panel, and then open it up for questions. And throughout, at any point in time, if you have a question, please feel free to pose it. And I will be interspersing your questions with some questions that I've thought through. So I want to begin with Lisa Soher Majaz, who's the author of the children's book, Naila Shares a Story, which is about a Palestinian child from Jordan who moves to the US with her family. Lisa's also the author of the prize-winning poetry volume titled Geographies of Light, and of poetry and prose in journals and anthologies across the US, the Middle East, Europe, and India. Lisa has co-edited 3 collections of critical essays on Arab, Arab American, and international women's writing. Her writing has been used in various non-literary venues, including the 2016 photography exhibit Aftermath, The Fallout of War, America and the Middle East, at the Harn Museum of Art, University of Florida. And her work has been translated into several languages, including Arabic and Greek. She lives in Cyprus. Sausan Abdidarraj is our second panelist, and she has won the American Book Award for her novel and stories, A Curious Land. She also won an Arab American Book Award and the Grace Pallis Prize, and it was shortlisted for the Palestine Book Award. Her previous short story collection, titled The Inheritance of Exile, was published in 2007 by the University of Notre Dame Press. In January 2020, Capstone Books launched her debut children's chapter series book, which is amazing, by the way, Farah Rocks, about a smart, brave Palestinian-American girl named Farah Najjar. In 2018, Sausan was named the 2018 Ford Fellow by USA Artists. She is a two-time recipient of an Individual Artist Award from the Maryland State Arts Council and teaches in the graduate writing programs at Johns Hopkins University and Fairfield University. In 2019, she launched an amazing viral campaign titled #TweetYourThobe on social media to promote Palestinian culture. And of course, you can always follow her on Twitter and at Susan Darraj, or her website at susanmuaddidarraj.com. Our third speaker today is Taghreed Najjar, who has been writing children's books for several decades now. Her output has included picture books for children ages 3 to 7 that have become classics, and books for early readers ages 7 to 8. And she's also written inspiring novels for teens and young adults that address difficult subjects, reflecting the realities of political and cultural conflicts in Palestine. A number of her books have been translated into several languages, including English, French, Danish, Swedish, Italian, Turkish, and Greek. And her books, she's the recipient of several awards, including the Etisalat Book Award in 2017 for her book, What Happened to My Brother Rames, and the Kitab al-Arabi Thought Award in 2013 for her picture book, Grandma Nafisa. Most recently, Taghreed's novella, Whose Doll Is This?, won the 2019 Etisalat Award for Arabic Children's Literature in the Young Adult category. She's also been nominated for the prestigious Alma Award. And finally, Daoud Kuttab is a friend and a Palestinian journalist and media activist. He's the former Ferris Professor of Journalism at Princeton University. Daoud is currently the Director General of the Community Media Network, which is a not-for-profit media organization dedicated to advancing independent media in the Arab region. Community Media Network is registered in Jordan and Palestine and administers Radio al-Balad in Amman. He's the author of Sesame Street, Palestine by Bear Manor Media. He was born in Jerusalem, studied in the United States, and began working as a journalist since 1980. His journalism career began in Palestinian print media at Al-Fajr, Al-Quds, and Al-Sannara, and he also has experience in the AV field as a documentary producer. He's established and headed between 1996 and 2007, the Institute of Modern Media at Al-Quds University. And in 1998, he moved to Amman, in part because of a family tragedy and remarriage. And in 2000, established the Arab world's first internet radio station called Amman.net. He's active in media freedom efforts in the Middle East. He's a regular columnist for the Jordan Times, Jerusalem Post, and the Daily Star in Lebanon. I want to thank all of you for joining us today, and welcome to the panel. So I want to begin by asking a very, very simple question to all of you, and I'll first pose it to Lisa, which is, when you think back to your own childhood, what were your favorite books? And did these books in any way reflect in your current writing? Lisa.
Well, I was a child of an American mother and a Palestinian father, and I grew up in Amman, but I went to the American school, and my mother was a school librarian. And so most of my reading was very centered on the books that my mother brought home from school and the books that I got at the library. And I wasn't fluent in Arabic. So I really grew up with American and British literature. And I grew up loving things like the Narnia series and Anne of Green Gables and, an abridged version of Moby Dick, Charles Dickens. So when I think back, it's like, okay. And I really, I love these books. And, my aunt from the States would send me things like Blueberries for Sal when I was very little and things. But in Black September in 1970, I happened to have checked out from the library The Diary of Anne Frank. And I read that while we were in the house, with the fighting literally happening on both sides of us. And that was a really powerful experience for me. And then after that, as I got older, I began to seek out literature that dealt with issues of war and conflict. But I have to say, I didn't read anything that had any inkling of my own life. None of the books that I read. I mean, I loved the books that I read. I loved the narratives. I loved the strong feminine characters. I loved the language. I was very drawn to beautiful language. I was drawn to nature. But I didn't find my own life in any of these books. And the first book that I ever read about Palestine, you'll be shocked, was Leon Uris's Exodus. My father had gotten it to read it to see what it was. It was there. And he walked past and saw me reading it, and he said, "Don't believe everything you read." So, but it was kind of stunning. And it wasn't until I got to the States for graduate school that I really had to educate myself. And my big hindrance was that I wasn't Arabic speaking. So I felt like I had a bifurcation in my life. I loved literature, but my literary life was so divorced from other parts of my life. And I had to find those points of connection in roundabout ways, always in roundabout ways. And I have to say that I found my way to Arab literature and Arab American literature through other kinds of literature. So for instance, the book that showed me that it was possible to think about my own identity and to deal with Arab issues was Maxine Hong Kingston's The Woman Warrior, a book about Chinese American identity. So, and then from that, I learned a lot more. But yeah, that's one of the reasons we need more books that address our lives. Yeah.
And so, Samson, let me ask the same question of you. What about growing up as a child in the United States?
So yeah, the same experience. It's funny, I loved Anne of Green Gables as well. That was
I
the book. That was my favorite book. And when I found out it was a series, I just my joy was uncontainable. So yeah, so I grew up reading all these books, and I love literature, and I love the way that literature makes you become more empathetic, because it makes you put yourself in the shoes of another character, of inside another world, another person's mind and their problems. And so I love that I could do that, and I could stretch my imagination to fit into someone else's world. But I have to say, I asked the same question: how come I never really read a book that just matched me perfectly? Why was I always stretching my imagination, right? And that's kind of a selfish question, but at the same time, I think, we have this theory. Dr. Rudine Sims Bishop came up with this theory that is talked about a lot in children's literature, the idea of windows and mirrors. Books should be a window for a lot of children to look out into another life, but it also should be sometimes, books should be mirrors so children can see their own lives in books. So I had a lot of windows. I didn't have a mirror. And I think the first young adult book that I read that had a young Palestinian or Arab character in it. That was, by the way, that was a positive character. I had a lot of representation of Arabs, but they were negative representations, right? We had the Jasmines, we had the terrorists, we had, all of these media stereotypes. So there were Arabs in the media and in literature, just not ones that matched my life or my experience or my truth. But the first book that I read that had an Arab character in it was actually Habibi by Naomi Shihab Nye. But I was in college by the time that book came out, and so I wished I'd had it when I was younger. So that's my experience. I just, a lot of windows, but not any mirrors until the
And
late
so,
90s, really.
and so with those windows and mirrors, has that influenced the way that you've now approached children's literature?
Absolutely. I mean, I think that, I wrote Farah Rocks literally because my daughter said the same thing to me that I'd been saying. When she was about 10, she said, I wish there was a book that, had Arab girls in it or a character with an Arab name in it. And it struck me that she asked the same question that I had asked 30 years earlier. So um, we shouldn't be waiting generations and still asking the same questions, right? So, and it's not that there aren't books out there, there are, but there are very few, right? And so I just think we need more books on the shelves that feature children that look like our children. And it's not just for Arab kids, it's not just for Palestinian kids to see themselves. Other children need to see Palestinian kids in books so that we're not constantly asked, where are you from and what are you and where is Palestine? And other kids need these books as much as we do.
Yeah, absolutely. Growing up, as I grew up in Canada, so the experience was very much the same, where Anne of Green Gables was definitely one of my favorites. But even at a younger age, there were books like the Anastasia series and Nancy Drew and all of these other books that were out there. And I remember as a child, it was, I think, the first time I'd ever heard the word casserole, because I didn't know what a casserole was. My Palestinian mother had never made a casserole. She still has never made a casserole. So it was a way for me to absorb the culture that was coming from white culture in Canada. And I too had also missed and wished that there had been a character that was eating the food that I was eating and that looked the way I did, and so on. So Taghreed, what about you?
It's very interesting because a lot of the books that you mentioned are also my favorites. So there must be something about that. But I grew up in Jerusalem and went to boarding school there. Some of you may know it, Schmitz Girls School. And as a boarder, I was there when I was 6. So books were really the most important thing in our life because they kind of opened a window to the outer world. And I remember also Nancy Drew. One of my favorite authors was Enid Blyton. I read all the books, The Files and Barnaby and I don't know what. And then later on, read a lot of the classics for Louisa May Alcott and Jane Austen, Charles Dickens. And I don't understand how. I mean, English was our second language, but we could read the unabridged Charles Dickens, the unabridged, and somehow we managed to understand and get involved with all these books. In this school, most of our reading was in English. So once I started reading about, of course, it was all classic. Nothing was about Palestine or Arabs, or they didn't figure in my reading scheme. But when I grew up and decided that I wanted to be a writer, it was very hard for me because all the things that I related to in my reading was all in English. My language was what I thought in English, I read in English, and I realized that we needed books in Arabic, so I had to work very hard and started reading Arabic books. And at that time, there was a very important publishing house, Palestinian also, Dar al-Fatah al-Arabi. I'm sure you're familiar with that publishing house. And it was mostly about Palestinian issues for children. And I was introduced to that. And in fact, it was my very first effort at writing. I sent my books to Dar al-Fatah al-Arabi, and it was one of the most important then publishing houses in the region. And was very happy when 3 of my stories were accepted. And then I felt that I was on my way. This really affected me, my reading. And I realized also, Lisa, you mentioned Anne Frank. And I remember reading Anne Frank and feeling mixed feelings about that. Mixed feelings because I kind of felt with this young girl and what she was going through. But at the same time, there was this feeling that this protagonist was used also something negative against the Palestinian people. I mean, there was this balance. Well, because of what she was like, everybody was sympathetic, and I was sympathetic with, with what she was going through. But she affected me in the way that I realized millions of copies were printed, and her story was everywhere. And it was then, and yesterday in one of the talks, Rada Karmi mentioned the same thing, that this is why she felt she had to write. It was because people do not know about us from history books or statistics or dry facts. They would know about us from books, from literature, from media. And that's why we need to present our story to everybody through books and literature. And this is why I started to do that.
And Dawood, you grew up also in Jerusalem. So what was that like? What were your influences as a child, if you want to share?
Yeah, I actually halfway through my youth, my parents immigrated to the States. So I was 12 when my parents picked up stuff and took us to New Jersey. So in a way, I have almost a blackout of everything that happened before. But I know that when I was in the US as a young person, I had a double life. In the house, everything was Arab. We listened to Fairuz, we ate kusa mahshi, we did everything. Then when I stepped out of the house, it was all American, and I wanted to be an American boy, and it was a very difficult kind of growing up. But then, at a very young age, I returned back to Jerusalem at 21 years old, and all of a sudden, the schizophrenia was over, and I realized what my identity was, and I entered into journalism, and that basically shaped my life. But really, books, as the speakers before me said, no books that I remember are in Arabic. All the books are the classics, the Shakespeare's, the different books that they taught us at school, Dickens and others. But I didn't really see or hear of books until when I returned and when I was in the 20s, and we started reading Ghassan Kanafani's and Emil Habibi's and all the other books. But to be honest with you, I have no memory of any books as a child except what we taught, what we learned at school.
Wow. Wow, that's incredible. I want to switch to Sausan and ask a question about why do we need to have representation of our identity in books? Is it even necessary?
I actually have a visual. I'm going to share my screen if that's okay. Yeah, I share this a lot, and I've written some op-eds about this concept actually. So let me see if you can you all see that?
We can, yes, thank you.
So this is a survey that's done every couple of years by the Cooperative Children's Book Center here in the States. And they go through all the children's books in the United States only published in that year. And they map out, or they take tabs on how many of the characters in the books are children of color, or how many are white. And you can see in 2018, of all the books published in 2018 for kids, these are picture books, chapter books, novels, YA books. Half of the books were published featuring mostly white characters. So you see this white child here with all these mirrors, right? He can see himself as an astronaut. He can see himself as a king. He can see himself as whatever. Look at the indigenous child here, who only has 1% of books published, featuring an indigenous child. And here we go, African American, 10%. And that's still better than it's been, right? Like it's in the past, it's been something like 3% for African American children. Latinx children, 5%. So, children can only, we all read Jane Austen, and we read Charles Dickens, and we read Anne of Green Gables. And so we saw strong, vibrant characters, and we can imagine ourselves there, But I think it's difficult to ask most children to, imagine something that's not even presented as a possibility. How do you ask a child to imagine himself as a king if that's not even offered as an option? The other kid gets to be the king, not you, you know? Um, And I'll say this also, I'm going to stop sharing the screen, but you can find this graphic online. I'll also say this, that most of the books featuring children of color feature them in what we call a crisis book. So there's this term that we use that, like Black children see themselves in the few books available to Black children in the United States. In most of the times, in most of the cases in those books, the Black child in the book is living through slavery, is living through segregation. So like there's this constant re-trauma, traumatization of children through the books. We don't really see a lot of books in the few that are available where children are living in the modern era in a healthy situation. So when I wrote, and by the way, you can see Arab children don't even make the list. We are below 1%. We don't have any representation in the United States, at least. Of course, I'm talking, this is US centric, but so that's why I think, because of those two reasons, like giving children this possibility to imagine themselves in a certain place, and also the idea of representing children of color in a book in a healthy way, right? That's why I named my character Farah, because Farah means joy. And I wanted her to be a character who is actually happy being who she is. She's happy to be Palestinian American. She speaks Arabic at home. She speaks English at school. There's like this kind of seamless transition in her life, and she incorporates her culture seamlessly into her life. And so she's a joyful character. And I wanted that. I wanted that book to be a book that Arab kids in the States can feel good about,
Yeah, it's very interesting. What struck me in that graphic wasn't just the white kids, it's that animals are more represented. That it's more possible for an animal to be some amazing whatever.
Yeah, a few of us have written about this. I've written some op-eds and we pointed that out, that it's easier to publish a book featuring an animal as a star than it is to feature a Latinx child or a South Asian child. It's unbelievable.
And so maybe I'll ask Taghreed this. Have you seen that one of the things I found interesting in the responses that you all gave, and one of the in the chat, it was noted that even though it's going across different generations and different places of geography, that many of us were reading the exact same books. Mm-hmm. And so given that it's gone across the different years and we're reading all these same books, I wanted to ask you as well whether you've seen a change in the way that Palestinian identity has been reflected in these books. Is it becoming better? Is it becoming worse? Is it even present at all? Taghreed.
Well, I think we're talking about two different things. So you who are living in the United States, you're writing for an American audience or a European audience, while I write for an Arab audience, unless the book gets translated and then it's available to other audiences. But I feel it's very important because even our Arab and Palestinian young adults are not aware of what is going on. Sadly, I mean, this is the truth. So I feel that through my books, this is what I'm trying to do, is give them stories that they can relate to. Now, when I was a student, we used to study about the Palestinian problem in school and what was going on. So we had some information. We also watched television, and television was only 2 stations. So you could watch the news and realize what was going on. But now with the media all over, children and young adults, they don't get the information that they need to get. So I felt that it was very important to write to this age group. And I started with my first novel was called Sitt al-Kul, which was Against the Tide.
Yeah.
And it was based on a true story about a young girl in Gaza called Madeleine Kallab, who became a fisherwoman. And I wrote this story, and the second, it was very well received. The kids could relate to it, and because I tried to make the characters real, and not, they were young, and whatever was happening in Gaza, I reflected in the story. And my second novel, I based it in Ramallah and in the West Bank and 1948. And my third story was about the diaspora. It was it started in Jaffa and then went to Chicago and all that. And I felt now a lot of these stories are being taught in schools and discussed and very, very well received by the kids. And the kids, it's very sad, but sometimes I would go to schools and find out that they know nothing about the separation wall. They have never, they live in Amman, in Jordan, but they've never heard about separation wall unless they have family there. They don't know about the checkpoints, about whatever is happening there. So I think we need also to have stories for the Arab and the Palestinian children in our part of the world that deals with these issues, not just present our image and for young adults in the US.
So not just the Palestinian American or Arab American child, but also reflecting on what life in Palestine is like, or what life in the diaspora is like.
Yeah.
So Lisa, I wanted to turn to you and ask a question, because we were chatting about this earlier in our email exchange, and somebody else has raised the question as well. And so a question from Sahar Mustafa, which is, if any of the authors has experienced pushback from publishers or from editors with their characters presenting as, quote, not Arab enough, or, quote, not American enough. This is what we were chatting about earlier. And if you've had any challenges in achieving a balance, or even having to redefine what American looks like.
Okay, well, I should pull back a little bit and say I'm pretty new to children's writing, but I did a lot of work on Arab American literature, and these kinds of issues, I heard a ton of stories. I've heard a lot of stories about how editors would declare the confines within which writers could write. There are stories about authors being asked to, the story is great, but don't let the characters be Arab, for instance, or slant it to be negative against Arab culture, these kinds of things. And certainly when I started trying to publish my poetry, I would sometimes wonder why certain things got accepted and other things didn't. With my children's writing, because I was asked by an educational press to write a book to meet their needs. So they wanted a book about an Arab child who comes to the States and has a hard time adjusting and goes through an experience. So I was working with this parameter, but I did have some challenges. First of all, some of the material that I put in that was more Palestine specific was taken out. And I don't know whether that was for space. I really don't know. It could have been, I think it was probably innocent, but it was trimmed. Other material was put in without my knowledge. Because I wrote it on commission, then the text was out of my hand. And this was a big challenge for me. Actually, this was a really big lesson for me, because representational issues are so important for us. And the ways in which Palestinians are represented in the West is such a hot button issue. And I suddenly realized that I had to fight to retain control over my own text. And again, I don't think that there was anything nefarious going on, but simply I was sort of in the line of production, and they were producing multicultural books. But then text was being put in that was not culturally authentic, or that I couldn't sign off on. I found out completely by accident that they were going to change the name of my character to a name that didn't sound at all Arab to me. And I posted on Facebook and I said, hey, is this an Arab name? And everybody said no. And my story was very carefully constructed around the meanings of the names of the characters. So I just felt like, okay, here I am trying to write a book that's, okay, it's a very simple story about a Palestinian child in Jordan. So Palestine is only there in the background, and she's coming, and I wanted to bring in these cultural issues, and I wanted the child to have the confidence to be who she was in her new environment. But I realized that even something that simple could be taken out of my control if I wasn't careful. And I know a lot of us have had experiences with things like book covers where the publishers, put covers on the books that we don't like at all. So all of these things are an issue. And it's not that there's a plot out there, but we are not yet at a point where we can feel comfortable that we can write what we want to say and it will be published without being packaged in some way. And then even once you get past the publication part of it, then there's the context of reception. And there's, going away from children's literature a little bit, just what kinds of stories are the ones that sell? You have to look at that too. So in adult literature, it's usually the narratives about Arab women who are abused by their cultures that are much more attractive to presses. And I wasn't really expecting to have these things come into play in children's literature, but I think that they do to some extent. And I know that in my own writing, I've always felt that because I'm Palestinian American, and I've always felt this dual expectation that I'm not Palestinian enough or I'm not American enough. And it's a fine line to try and figure this out. Going back to what you were talking about before with Taghreed, though, my old primary school teacher, my English teacher from Jordan, every year she teaches some of my poetry to her students at the Abdul Hamid Sharaf School. And they all write me letters for my birthday. It's a wonderful birthday present. And every year, the thing that the kids say again and again and again is that they don't like poetry, but they've never seen poetry about the Arab world or about Palestine. And some of them get very excited to realize that one can write about being Palestinian. And I'm doing it in English. And I'm not claiming access to something more than I have, but I think it's really important because there is this lack. There's a lack of representation in the West, and then there's a lack of access also for kids in the Middle East. So yeah, that's kind of getting a little bit astray, but that's a kind of a winding answer. Yeah.
It's not, and thank you. It's important. And I actually was going to ask, I'm going to skip over you for just a second, Daoud, because Susan has most recently been in this area, and I wanted to ask you the same. What was it like with Farah Rocks? Because Farah is clearly, it's clearly an Arabic name there, or I guess you can also do Farah. But she's a strong character. Did you get any pushback from the publisher, and then what was it like in terms of distribution?
A couple things about that. So Capstone is actually the publisher that eventually bought the series, and they've been wonderful to work with. But it was hard to sell the series because, and for the same reasons that Lisa said, I think the publishing industry in the United States and maybe even in Canada is filled with very well-intentioned, very liberal white people. I don't know any other way to say it. They're very liberal and they're very well-intentioned. They're very progressive, but they're progressive on everything except for Palestine, right? This is the problem that even exists in the publishing field. So their vision of Arab culture is still the vision that dominates the rest of the media, which is that Arab culture is somehow oppressive and patriarchal. We know it's patriarchal. Okay, you don't have to tell an Arab woman her culture is patriarchal, but it's not like it's more patriarchal than every other culture on the face of the earth, right? So why is it that we are uniquely stuck with this? So I've always said this. I said this just the other day in a session, that if I wanted to write a book with my Arab name, and if I wanted to write a book featuring an Arab girl who fights against her culture, I will be a New York Times bestselling author.
Very true.
Very easily, right? That's right. But because it will have that authentic, flair to it, and so on and so forth. And we've seen people do this as a hoax. We've seen the infamous Noor Makhouri, who wrote a book about honor killings in Jordan, and it took a Jordanian journalist, right, to actually, Rana Husseini, to actually find out that this was a hoax, because the rest of the world bought it hook, line, and sinker. So this is very pervasive, and it even filters down to children's literature. So by the time that we we had approached, my agent had approached many publishers with this idea, and there was this kind of like sense of like, well, we don't know if it really would sell because it doesn't really fit what people know about Arab culture. So Capstone took a chance, and I'm glad they did, and I hope they're happy with the results. But one thing, the last thing I'll say about it is that often with book covers, as Lisa said, and I've been burned before by book covers, but I really wanted to shape and have an influence on the way that Farah looks. So the agent worked with the publisher to get me some kind of approval rights over the way that she looks. And they found a marvelous illustrator, Ruaida Ma'anna, who is actually Arab from Colombia. So she knew exactly what she was doing. And the way that she drew Farah, I thought was perfect. She has this curly black hair. She has these thick eyebrows. She's got big eyes. She's a, and I was so pleased with that representation of this girl because I wanted her to look, the only other Arab girl that kids see in the States is like Jasmine or something like that. I wanted her to look really like authentically Arab and cute. She's like a cute character. So I was glad to have the approval over the illustrations because the illustrations really do make a difference.
I do.
And she looks like you a little bit.
Yeah, she does look a little like you.
Looks like my daughter, actually.
Right.
So now I want to turn to you. It's the same, I imagine, when it comes to television. What's it been like in that realm where you've had a lot more of work to do?
Yeah, I don't know if you see my book cover. I'm trying to put my book cover on it, but the I entered the children's sphere not in writing books, but in producing children's programming.
Right.
The Oslo Accords brought Sesame Street into Palestine, and they really wanted to produce a program with Palestinians. And of course, they brought with them all the stereotypes that you can imagine. But we worked hard on that. We worked hard on having the writers from Palestine writing stories about Palestinians, and we did the Muppet characters are really not culturally problematic, but it's in the live action and in some of the animation that we really, I think we brought a lot of the Palestinian stories. I remember Hannah Elias did a story with a child from El Bire, actually, and he kept on looking for a child with whose teeth were gone because he really wanted to reflect. And she did a story, and he did a story about embroidery. And the girl goes to see her grandmother, and they look at the embroidery, and she makes, and we use the embroidery as a way of teaching children colors and numbers and so on. And so it was really good that we were able to use some of the cultural icons that we always talk about, but in a children's program. And of course, we had a huge challenge because until we actually produced the Palestinian Sharia Simsim, most of the children who watch television in the Arab world were watching basically subtitled or dubbed either Western or Japanese programming. And because there's 26 Arab countries and the producers wanted to save money, they were all done in classical Arabic. And so, the children are learning and they're telling their parents, translate to me what they're saying in Arabic, because they were talking like you would talk in the King James Version or in Shakespeare. How art thou doing today? Children don't say these things. And we had to make a big fight, even with educators, to say we want the children to listen to the Muppets talking in the colloquial Arabic, not in the classical Arabic. It was a huge fight, but we won that fight. And so the program was much more understood and engaging with the children because it showed them and it spoke in their language and it reflected, their history and so on. And of course, we had problems with New York. I mean, when we did the alphabet, when we came to the Ain, we wanted to put alam and we put the Palestinian flag, and they, they wanted to put the black and white car racing flag, and we said no, we want the Palestinian flag. We didn't want to put everything, to be so in your face, but every now and then when we did the post office, we wanted to do Palestine Post, which actually existed after Oslo. So we did, few things that we tried to remind people of their character and their identity. And so television, actually, that really was very successful in in helping us use television to bring to children some of their own culture and some of their own icons. And I think I'm quite happy we did that. The book I wrote is actually about the making of the Sesame Street and the challenges we had because the politics got into everything, and we had to really make all kinds of fights to just get the actors in from Gaza, to take the sets, to in addition to the content that I talked about. So it was quite a challenge, but I think we produced a program that our children were quite happy with in Palestine TV. Initially, it was a bit hesitant, but then later they were very happy to show it on television.
Yes, and then of course you also had the pro-Israel lobby that then came after Shara Simpson and started to attack it on that level as well. So another layer of trying to censor and trying to control, which is there. There's a question from Mohammed Isa, which is actually a really good one. I'm going to start from the bottom and go up. And he asks, I'll read it to you. He says, I grew up never reading a single book except for the Quran and books for schoolwork. My mom couldn't read and write, and my father worked from dawn to dusk to support the family. However, my mother was not illiterate. She was a blessed and wonderful storyteller. My question is, what role did or does oral storytelling storytelling play in your writing? So if I'll open that up to any one of you who would like to ask. It's a really wonderful question. Taghreed, please.
Yeah, I think that's very important because oral storytelling is very important in our culture, and it's the basis of children's literature that we have today. A lot of writers have reproduced the cultural stories that we have, and I tried to do that, but I didn't reproduce the same story. I made it into modern story, and Dawood, if you remember, it's قصة الغول, the whole story.
Yes.
Sorry, yeah. We actually, the actor is called the Fadi al-Ghul, and we actually used the book you write.
Yes, it's wonderful. Yes.
So it was about fear and not about. So I used one of the local and stories from our culture and made it into a modern kind of story. And it's been translated by Interlink into English, and really has won a lot of acclaim here. It was
wonderful.
Voted as best of the best for Chicago Public Library, which is really something. And using these stories in a modern way, I think is helpful and enriches children's literature. And that's what I try to do with my books. And a lot of writers do that too.
That's wonderful. Thank you, Taghreed.
I was in a theater group called Al-Hakawati in Jerusalem, and we also tried to use the oral history of Palestine and the Arab world, of the storyteller, and to use that metaphor, that actuality in where stories were told by the storytellers, and the children would gather around in the house, in the courtyard, and somebody would tell stories. So it's a very well used way of telling stories. And you're right, oral history and oral stories are very much part of our culture. The problem is we need to document them and reproduce them. I mean, the whole idea of books is that many people can see and read the story, not just few who are around that time.
Yeah, I know there's been a few. I can recall at least two that have done them. One is Arab Folk Tales by, I think her name is Anaya Bushnak is the last name, and then there's another one with the surname that I've forgotten. But there are a couple of anthologies as well in Arabic that are escaping my mind. But it's very, very, very important. And thank you, Mohammed, for the question. Does anybody else want to add to that?
I just want to say that in my children's book, the child in the States has to share a story in a club. And it could be anything, a story about something that happened in her family or whatever, but I have her share her grandmother's favorite story. And I did that because I wanted to tap into that kind of tradition as well. So I wanted to have her bringing something from her own culture into this space. So.
Wonderful. Yeah. And of course, we have the whole Juha series and so on. So there's another question from Liane Al Hussein. And Susan, I think I'll pose it to you because you mentioned this. So Leanne writes, if we are to avoid creating crisis narratives for young characters, what examples of interesting conflicts or issues can we create as children's / young adult authors with Palestinian identities? Maybe some pre-existing or hypothetical examples. So this was something that both you, Sausan, and Taghreed had touched upon.
I just want to clarify, I'm not saying that we should avoid crisis narratives. For example, like in the United States, like we need to have books about segregation and slavery and Native American oppression. We need those books too. What I'm saying is that the publishing industry in the States, at least, when it features children of color, it features them almost exclusively in those kinds of books. So it's almost like we can only imagine children of color when they are the friend of the white star of the book, you know, and that's what I don't like. So I'm just saying that because we only have so few books, that's the problem. And so we need a broader range of books featuring not just children of color, but of course, for my interest, Arab American and Palestinian American children. So we just need a lot more books so we can see that range. We can see all those mirrors being offered. Yeah.
Also, when we're working on issues of mutual respect and tolerance, we tried a lot to work on the village versus the refugee versus the city people, and we also worked a lot on male and female, obviously, issues and stereotyping, and also people with disabilities, you know. And there's a lot of problems we have in our society where they're pushed aside and they're not respected and so on. So there's a lot of issues that you can deal with without having to get into the crisis issue. So yes, for sure.
Taghreed, you had mentioned a little bit of this, so I don't know if you want to tackle it.
If you want, please.
But the issue of if we're going to try to avoid these crisis narratives, you know, what issues should we perhaps also be focusing on as well? You had mentioned earlier, you're just trying to relate to people what it's like to live in Palestine, things like the checkpoints and the wall and all of these other.
Trying to live a normal life. And having different things like positive and negative in the society. I mean, reflecting that. For example, in the story about Gaza, there's a rap group, kids who are making music. And there are doing other things other than the crisis. There's a crisis in the story. What I'm trying to say, and when I present the story, I try to show them that Gaza is just like any other place. There are many different things. And I remember that one time when I was having a discussion with people in Gaza about the story, one of the young men there asked me, why did you put rap music? This is not very important. I mean, this is not, this doesn't describe what Gaza is. And I said, there are rap groups and there are artists, there are writers, there are all sorts of people in Gaza. So why should we just focus on one thing? Let's show that there are all these different people doing different things. And I think that's important. Also, for example, the important thing about, I haven't read the story about Farah. I'm really looking forward to read that. Great. But I think it's more than enough for an American kid to read about Farah being just like any other kid in the class and realizing that maybe there are a few things. When they go home, they eat something that is different. In their home, there is a cushion that looks different from the cushions in their home. So that's the important thing. We don't focus, it has to be part of the story rather than we just keep hitting it on the head all the time.
Yeah. So, Taghreed, I want to stick with you for a second because there's a question that's been asked of you, and it's by Sundus Chadi. And Sundus writes, Sausan and Lisa talked about the subject of representing the Arab-Palestinian identity for an audience in the United States. I wonder if Taghreed can shed some light on the subjects or the themes or the symbols that have been written for the Arab audience in the Arab world. In other words, how is Palestine represented or Palestinians represented in the Arab world?
Yeah. Well, the stories that I chose are stories that I thought would be enjoyed by young adults. So they're not just about one thing. They are about many things. They're about friendship. They're about a little bit of romance. They're about adventure. So that's all weaved in against the background of what is going on. So the Palestinian story is there as the background rather than as the main thing. So the checkpoint is for them to pass through to do something that is important in the story. I think, like one of them is, it's like a treasure hunt in Palestine. They have to cross over and pass all these difficulties. And another one is a lot of problems that they face and how they, for example, the protagonist is living in the United States. She was born there. She's an American Palestinian, but at the same time, she has these mixed feelings about her identity. She wants to feel American. She wants to be like the other girl, people in her class. But at the same time, her family is pulling her and the memories of the family. And so there's this conflict and how she solves this conflict during the action of the story. So these are little things that I try to do. The most important thing is the story, what is happening there. And the Palestinian issue somehow becomes part of it naturally.
So I want to turn, I'm going to ask Lisa and Sausan this question. It's by Alice Rothschild. Hi, Alice, nice to see you. She asked the question, again, going back to publishers in the United States, she says, are there publishers that are more receptive to children's books about Arab or Palestinian kids? Have you had that experience at all? You mentioned your publisher, Sausan.
Well, Capstone Books, yes, they also, and I knew they would be good to approach because if you look at their book list, they have books featuring South Asian, African American, indigenous characters. So they have a pretty extensive book list with what we call own voices authors. So they really want to work with people who are writing about their own communities, which is really nice. There are a lot of book publishers, like Interlink Books, for example, is a magnificent publisher. There are other publishers that are, doing this kind of work. In terms of the Scholastics and the Random Houses and the Simon and Schusters, I think in those areas, it's more an issue of finding an editor that can understand. We need more people of color or more Arab Americans in those kinds of editorial positions to acquire these books. But even the issue that they have is, even if you find an acquisitions editor that likes your project and really believes in your work, they have to sell it to the people above them, right? They have to sell it to the marketing team and so on and so forth. So that's where it becomes an issue. I think it's more of an issue, therefore, it's a long way of answering your question. It's more of an issue of maybe finding an agent that believes in your work and knows the publishing world very well and knows who to approach, as opposed to finding a publisher yourself. The agents can often kind of weed through who would be more supportive and who would not.
Yeah, it tends to be that the word market tends to be the code for white and for wanting to have a certain space for Palestinian, or let's say non-white characters and non-white authors. And it's interesting as you mentioned earlier, when you see the space that is opened up, not just in children's books, but also in other books, in adult books, that the market is a code for the stereotype that they have defined for where Palestinians belong, Palestinians and non-white.
And I keep thinking of this hoax by Norma Khoury, this book called, I think her book was called Honor Lost or something.
Honor Lost, yeah.
Where nobody actually in that whole publishing house researched to see had there actually been a murder that took place in that time. It should be easy to find, and the Australian publishers, and I mean, this woman was traveling the world raking in money from that book before Rana Husseini actually said, wait a second. What's going on here, and so, but it goes to show you that they're super they'll spotlight you and want to talk about how authentic your story is, but they'll buy another story that fits the narrative, which is the white market's narrative, right? So that's exactly to your point.
Yeah, absolutely. Lisa.
Yeah, I just wanted to say I was pretty lucky because I got my publication. Naomi Shihab and I gave my name to an organization called Literary Safari that was finding books for a publisher, and they worked with me first, and then I published with Benchmark Education, and the problem there is, I mean, they actually, aside from these issues, now the second book that I wrote with them, which is not out yet, the editor that I worked with was just wonderful and very open to, like, I actually expressed some of my hesitations about how Palestinian can I make my character and all of this. And he was very much more open to it than I had expected to be. And I have to say that he worked very hard with me because we were trying to figure out exactly where the child should be located, because I had been a bit fuzzy about where exactly she was in the first book. And then I did a lot of research to figure out exactly what suburb of Detroit she should be in. And would it make sense in this school setting for the things that I was trying to write about to happen? So I was very impressed by that attempt for authenticity. But this is an educational press, and I don't know how much of a reach this book is going to have, because it's sold in 6-packs from the press. It was my first book was on Amazon very briefly, and then it was off of Amazon. So I think it's great that they're trying to do this, and I think they are trying to get these voices in, and they're trying to treat them with respect and all of this. But the question is then, how far will they go? Because if this book is not available people wanted to buy it, and it's like you have to buy a 6-pack. You can't just buy one, these kinds of things. So there are spaces that are opening up, but you have to find a press that's open to it, and it's kind of hit or miss. And I think like Selson said, it's really hard. I mean, the bigger presses, you probably have to, I've never gone through an agent for anything, then you probably have to do that. And yeah, so.
I had a hard time finding a publisher also. I must have sent my proposal to 30 publishing houses and they wouldn't take it. Finally, the one who took it actually produces books about making films and making television. So it actually fit that, although I wanted it to be a more mainstream book. So it's hard. The publishing world in America is very hard.
Yeah,
it is. And so I want to turn a little bit to the issue. So Rima has asked a great question. I'm going to turn a little bit to that. And I'm going to ask both Taghreed and Dawood this question. So Rima Najjar, hi Rima, nice to see you. She asks, what are the problems particular to the Palestinian situation when it comes to publishing?
It's to me?
Yes.
Yeah. As I was just saying, most of the publishers wouldn't touch a book on Palestine. I thought my book, Sesame Street, Palestine, the word Sesame Street would attract publishers, but they wouldn't go for it. They refused every one of them, and I couldn't really get them to even, negotiate or engage with me. So it's a problem. It's a problem, a huge problem in America, especially about serious books, let alone children's books, where minds are being set and where ideas are being created for the future. So it's somebody was writing in the comments that we should think of a Palestinian American publishing house, or maybe self-publishing, or finding ways to bypass this monopoly that is blocking many people to publish. So I don't have experience with children's books, but the experience I had was very difficult.
And Taghreed, did you want to tackle that as well?
Yeah, I think, as you said, most of my experiences with Arab books, Arabic books in Arabic, but I had like two. Sitt al-Kul, the one I mentioned before, was translated into Italian. And I remember that the Italian publisher accepted the book, but then while it was being translated, they started getting cold feet and afraid, about some things. And they wanted to kind of make it much simpler and edit it in such a way that Israel wouldn't look like an aggressor. And we had lots of discussions with it. The translator was also Palestinian Italian, and she really put up a big fight to keep the book as it is. So that's another thing. Even if they accept the book, then later on they kind of have second thoughts. Maybe it will create problems, maybe it will. But I'm glad that finally they went through with it. It took longer than usual, and it's out in Italian. Another experience I had, another book was published in the UK, and it was a picture book. It was about about Musahhar, Ramadan Musahhar, and it was set in. I set it in Lifta, which is my grandparents' village in Palestine, near Jerusalem. And the illustrations showed that. But as a picture book, Lifta was only mentioned as the place that the story took place, nothing political. When they sent us the draft, Lifta was gone. There was no mention of Lifta. But I insisted and said, this is very important to the writer that the village stay in the story and be mentioned. And, we kind of convinced them. And it was not only did they keep it there, but they also had a postscript at the end explaining where Lifta was and why it was important to the writer. So, sometimes you have to put up a fight because it's really not easy. I mean, it's like a taboo subject. As Dawood said, just the word Palestine makes them cringe.
Yes, and you remember there was, I think about a decade ago, there was the issue over the attempt to block the young adult book, A Little Piece of Ground, by, I believe it was Elizabeth Laird, when that came out. It was a little bit more than a decade ago. I mean, I'm forgetting my dates, but yes, there was an attempt to block that as well, for the same reasons that that it was tackling issues relating to Palestine.
And you'll have an easier time selling a book if you call your character like an Arab American, not a Palestinian American, at least in the States. That's what I found too. Like they'll say to you, can we just say she's Arab American? I'm like, you could, but not all Arab Americans are the same, right? Like we have different experiences. So, but I know what they're doing. They're refraining from using the word Palestinian. So that's a problem too. So we have to push back on that.
Yes, absolutely, absolutely. And then with Lisa, there's a question for you by Nancy Wechsler, and it is, what's the name of your new book and when is it coming out?
It's called Naila Makes Mamul. It's a sequel to it's the same character, but I don't know when it's coming out. It's been put on the back shelf now because the press has moved on to some other projects, I think related to COVID. So I don't know. I sent in the final copy in the summer, and I don't expect to hear anything until next summer. So we'll see. We'll see.
Hopefully very soon. Hopefully very soon. So I was going to ask a question about what advice you would give to parents. I'll give you my own personal circumstances, and then maybe I'll be the subject of your advice, which is the mother of a 6-year-old little boy who is Palestinian, but also is raised by a mother who was raised in Canada, and a father who was raised in the United States, living here in Haifa. We're in the Haifa room, but I'm actually in Haifa. And what advice would you give to me and to others and to other parents about the types of books and what it is that we should be looking for, and how it is that we should be getting the mirrors, as you put it, Sausan, across to them? So I'll open up to you, Sausan, first, and then go across the panel.
That's a great question. I'll say a couple of things, which is that I think it's important for us as Palestinians to understand that we are a people that have been living in a diaspora. So just because somebody is Palestinian and doesn't speak Arabic or speaks broken Arabic or um, only cooks Arabic food sometimes doesn't mean you're not Palestinian. You are Palestinian to your core. I'm not even speaking to you, I'm speaking to everybody out there, because I think sometimes we feel like frauds when we say we're Palestinians and we're trying to raise our children to speak Arabic, but we don't even speak it that well. I mean, we are Palestinian people. We have been put in a situation where our parents were taken from their land, and we have been living in a diaspora, and we are doing our damn best to hold on to our culture, and we're not going to lose it. Um, and I think it's important to pass on our love for Palestine and our determination to return in everything that we do. And I think literature is part of that. So finding books, wherever you can find them, that feature Palestinian characters, just putting them in front of our kids and making them understand that you have a connection to a larger family. It's like sometimes I would go to Palestine in the summers with my family, and I would meet like 30 people, and I would find out later they're all my cousins somehow. That's how we are as a people. I think a lot of you this weekend, I think with Palestine Rights, I hope you have this experience of feeling like you've met your cousins. Um, and I think books can make you feel like that, you find a character that you connect to, and that character becomes your friend. That character stays with you. So finding books that show that make our kids feel connected, and just putting them in front of our kids, I think is a very important thing to do for their own self-esteem. It's very hard to be Palestinian in the diaspora. You're attacked all the time. So just um, books can be their friends. And I mean that very personally and sincerely. And it will make them feel connected to the larger family of Palestinians around the world. I hope I've answered that question.
You absolutely did. This is this is the challenge of living in 48 Palestine is exactly that, is that you are in the diaspora in your own country. So twice and three times and four times removed in many ways, with an attempt to try to completely erase the identity, the culture, the heritage, the history, our ancestry, you name it. So thank you very much. I want to ask that also of anybody else. Dawood, yes, I see you have your hand up. I was hoping you would answer.
I don't want to disagree with my fellow panelists, and I love to have stories that are Palestinian character driven. But children read books that are interesting and exciting. The book is not exciting. You can have all the Palestine you want, and it's not going to be read. So I think we need to find a way to push our writers to write really good books. If the book is good, children will read it. And the best would be if there are good books and have Palestine in it. But just to have Palestine in it alone, I feel like we try very hard to get them to read them. They're not going to read them. They're not going to read them if they're not good books. So, I would put a lot of emphasis on the book being good, and not as much emphasis on the Palestine part. I'm sorry if I sound like I'm disagreeing with the panelists, but I really think, good books are read by children. Children can tell good books from not good books.
Yeah, and I think we're in agreement. I'm not suggesting that we put badly written books. We need well-crafted books for sure. Yeah.
Okay.
Absolutely. So we've got just a couple of minutes left, and there's an excellent question that came up, and which is that this is by Noor Abu Hijle, who asks that children's broadcasting was mentioned before. I'm curious if any of these marvelous authors, and they are indeed marvelous, are trying to turn their books onto the screen. Anybody? Personally love to see them, but yes, Taghreed.
Well, I really can't give any details, but there's one of my novels is being considered for a series of, and it's also set in Palestine, so I'm very happy. And if it happens, then it will be a great thing.
Yes,
We're discussing the contract now and all that.
that is wonderful. That's exactly, that's a big.
I sold my rights to the book to also a filmmaker who wants to do a kind of a Hollywood style book, a film. I mean, I don't know if it will succeed, but he put up some money for that. I hope it works.
Wow, that's wonderful. And Sausan, any chance that we'll see Farah rocking the screen?
Inshallah. I mean, there's the rights to the movies and to a show and to the toy, like a doll, like a Farah doll that is, in the contract and available and being talked about sometimes. I'm not sure if anything will come of it, but inshallah, we'll see.
Inshallah, inshallah. And Lisa.
Well, no broadcasting for me. But I just wanted to go back to your question about as a parent, and I want to pick up on what Sausan was saying. And my kids are even more diluted because their father was Greek Cypriot, and then I'm half American, half Palestinian. And what I told my kids is, you're not half or 1/3 of anything. You're all of it, all at the same time, all together. And for my son, that he's just taken that on board. And just today he said something about, well, because I'm Arab, and the honest truth is he doesn't have too much access to it, but he's taken it on. My daughter, it's when she was, I also wanted to mention this just in terms of how we present books too, because when my daughter was little, I was searching desperately like you for books that would reflect something about Palestine or the Arab world to her. And I would read whatever I could find, or I would tell stories about Palestine to her, little stories, and she didn't like it. And she wouldn't mind if I would tell her or read her stories that were set in Jordan. And I asked her why. And she said, Mommy, Palestine makes you sad, and I don't like to see you sad. So then I realized that we also, as parents, we bring so much to our children, and they pick up things that we don't even realize. I mean, suddenly I realized she's watching me watch the news, things like this. So even when I'm reading something like City's Secrets by Naomi Shihab Nye, which is such a beautiful story, but it's got a sad element, and my daughter figured out that mommy is picking up on something on this. So I think what you said, Sausan, is to make the stories also joyful. I think that's so important. We need to get back to the richness. We need to get back to all the wonderful things. And we also need to educate about the realities. We need that. But we need that full tapestry. And I, as a parent, needed to be working harder to get that wealth there. And so we can bring the books, and then we bring it in how we present the books as well. So, yeah. And I think broadcasting could be another way to do that, because you can bring in the music, and you can bring in so many things. So, yeah.
Such an excellent point. Yeah.
It really is. Well, I think our time has come to an end. I'm going to, I'll turn it to all of you if you have any final thoughts that you'd like to share before we say goodbye.
Thank you, Diana, for moderating and for organizing the panel.
My pleasure. My pleasure.
Thank you so much. So wonderful. Just so rich and wonderful.
It really is. Thank you all. And thank you everyone for attending. And once again, thank you to all the organizers for putting this together. My final thanks to Daoud, to Sausan, Taghreed, and to Lisa, and to the interpreters, and to everyone. So wishing you all a good day, and hopefully see you. Hopefully next we'll have this in Palestine. This would be wonderful.
Inshallah. Bye.